Engines roar across an empty runway outside Fort Worth, then fall silent. Inside the hangar, assembly lines for F-35 jets have stopped. A colonel leans over the console. "We're out of magnets," he mutters. No one laughs. Somewhere between Tianjin and Long Beach, the shipments have stopped, every crate of Chinese processed rare earths frozen by new export controls. Within hours, missile assembly lines stall, F-35 production halts, and the phones at the Treasury begin ringing off the hook. Scott Bessent walks into the briefing room, pale but steady, and says only this: 78% of our defense industry just went dark. But the situation is more complex than retaliation. U.S. Geological Survey data from September 2025 shows that while the United States holds about 15% of global rare earth reserves, it refines less than 10% of global supply. China processes over 90% of the world's rare earths, including 98% of the heavy grades crucial to defense manufacturing. That asymmetry gives Beijing immense leverage, yet also exposes it to dependency on Western demand. Whether China's export curbs are strategic or defensive remains under debate. Bloomberg Intelligence reported last week that China's new export licensing applies to all products containing over 0.1% rare earths by value. The move, justified on national security grounds, mirrors U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors imposed in 2023. Washington called those necessary for preventing military diversion. Beijing is now using the same rationale, one that the United States helped normalize. This symmetry undercuts Washington's moral position while revealing how both powers weaponize interdependence under the same legal logic. Inside the Pentagon, procurement officers are scrambling. A classified Department of Defense briefing obtained by Reuters describes imminent production slowdowns at three major contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, because of magnet shortages. Officials estimate that every week of supply delay pushes delivery schedules back by 1.8 weeks. The math compounds exponentially across multiple systems. For now, the Pentagon is reallocating stockpiles originally reserved for naval radar upgrades to sustain air defense production. The consequences extend beyond defense. The Wall Street Journal reports that General Motors, Tesla, and Boeing have requested special export licenses from Beijing to secure limited shipments of neodymium and praseodymium, both used in EV motors and aircraft actuators. China approved some licenses but capped them at 6-month validity, forcing constant renegotiation. Analysts at Nomura called it a short leash designed to demonstrate control without full decoupling. So, financial markets have already reacted, and it's quite telling. On October 17th, rare earth prices in Shanghai surged a staggering 41% in just one trading session, according to data from the Shanghai metals market. In contrast, shares of U.S. defense suppliers fell nearly 9% that same day. Investors are treating the mineral restrictions not just as temporary pressure, but as the emergence of a new strategic weapon. Yet this weapon carries risks for Beijing too. If these export cuts are prolonged, well, Chinese manufacturers who rely on foreign assembly markets, especially in Europe, will face their own bottlenecks. Bessent's call for a global coalition is beginning to materialize. Reuters has confirmed that Washington has approached Australia, Canada, and India to coordinate supply diversification. The U.S. Geological Survey notes that Australia's Lynas rare earths currently provides about 15% of global refined output, but its expansion capacity remains constrained by chemical processing limits. Meanwhile, India has reserves, sure, but lacks refining infrastructure. According to India's Ministry of Mines, developing such capacity would require an investment of $4 to $6 billion and, at least 4 years. In 2022, Washington announced its critical minerals strategy, pledging to end dependency on Chinese processing by 2030. But the Government Accountability Office reported in July 2025 that only 12% of that goal has been achieved. Projects in Texas and California remain behind schedule due to environmental reviews, cost overruns, and insufficient offtake guarantees. The policy assumption that market incentives alone could rebuild a critical industry has collided with geopolitical speed. The contradiction now confronting Washington is structural. To sustain deterrence, the United States needs rare earths, but to obtain them, it relies on the very state it seeks to contain. The Treasury's latest white paper, released October 15th, explicitly admits that China's dominance in refining and magnet manufacturing presents a systemic risk to U.S. defense readiness. That admission transforms a supply issue into a national security liability. And yet, rather than de-escalate, both sides are escalating rhetorically. China's Ministry of Commerce insists the measures are defensive. A statement published October 10th declared, "Recent military provocations and export restrictions by foreign powers compel China to secure materials essential to national security." The wording deliberately echoes U.S. justifications for semiconductor bans. Meanwhile, the People's Daily framed Washington's reaction as proof of strategic overextension, arguing that a nation dependent on imported magnets cannot threaten the world's largest processor of those magnets. From an economic standpoint, the numbers speak bluntly. According to the IMF's October World Economic Outlook, U.S. defense manufacturing output grew 11% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2025, but 78% of its rare earth inputs originated from China. A cutoff, even partial, could erase that growth in a single quarter. The Commerce Department estimates that replacing Chinese supply with Australian or domestic production would cost up to $17 billion and take a minimum of 5 years. Meanwhile, Beijing's leverage is not absolute. China earns roughly $13 billion annually from rare earth exports. A full embargo would hurt its own economy, especially its high-tech manufacturing sector, which depends on foreign machinery. This mutual vulnerability underpins what analysts at the Peterson Institute call weaponized interdependence. Neither side can strike without injuring itself, yet both seem willing to risk collateral damage for strategic signaling. By October, Trump's administration announces retaliatory measures, a 100% tariff on all Chinese electronics and a proposal to ban Chinese airliners from Russian airspace, a route vital for flights linking Asia with North America. Treasury Secretary Bessent frames the response as measured pressure, but Bloomberg analysts note that these steps further entrench global bifurcation. Countries are being forced to choose sides not by ideology but by supply chain exposure. In Europe, the reaction is, well, pretty divided. Germany's economy minister told the Financial Times that de-risking does not mean decoupling, but, Berlin is still privately worried about its dependence on Chinese magnet imports for electric vehicle motors. The European Union actually imports 98% of its rare earth magnets from China, according to the European Commission's Critical Raw Materials Act report from September. France has urged coordinated diversification, but EU analysts admit that replacing Chinese refining capacity is honestly decades away. The situation gets even more complicated when new satellite data analyzed by the U.S. Geological Survey suggests that Chinese exporters have started redirecting shipments to Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia and Vietnam, to kind of mask re-exports. If that's verified, it would mean that Beijing is selectively enforcing its ban to reward neutral partners while isolating Washington. Now, China denies any such redirection, but trade manifests reviewed by Bloomberg show spikes in intermediary shipments that are, well, pretty consistent with evasion. This geopolitical chessboard definitely extends beyond just minerals. Japan, having already faced a similar rare earth embargo from China back in 2010, is quietly getting ready for contingencies. Tokyo's industry ministry announced new subsidies on October 18th to, triple domestic magnet recycling output by 2027. South Korea, meanwhile, has reached out to Canada for joint investment in refinery infrastructure. These moves suggest that U.S. allies are hedging, supporting Washington's rhetoric, but at the same time, diversifying pragmatically to avoid direct confrontation. Inside Beijing's Zhongnanhai compound, advisors frame the export controls as a calculated warning rather than an act of aggression. One Chinese economist quoted by the South China Morning Post stated, "If the United States can weaponize semiconductors, China can weaponize magnets. The principle is symmetrical. Yet that symmetry cuts both ways. Every act of weaponization accelerates global fragmentation. At this stage, the narrative reaches its point of inversion. What began as a trade restriction now reveals a deeper contest, not over minerals, but over who defines the rules of dependency. Washington accuses Beijing of coercion. Beijing accuses Washington of hypocrisy. Both are right within their respective frames. The system itself, the decades-long outsourcing of strategic production, has collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Markets respond accordingly. The Financial Times reports that Western defense contractors have begun revising their 2026 earnings guidance downward by as much as 15%. Investors interpret this not as temporary volatility, but as structural revaluation. The International Monetary Fund warns that if the standoff persists through year-end, global manufacturing output could contract by 0.4%, roughly equivalent to the 2011 Japanese supply shock after the Fukushima disaster. In Washington, congressional hearings turn tense. Lawmakers demand to know why successive administrations allowed the United States to become so dependent. A Defense Department official responds bluntly, "Because it was cheaper." The silence that follows captures the political cost of decades of efficiency worship. Meanwhile, the White House dispatches Scott Bessent to Seoul to coordinate with allies during the upcoming Trump-Xi summit. The objective is to pressure China to issue long-term export guarantees in exchange for tariff relief. But, leaked memos suggest Beijing will demand the lifting of semiconductor restrictions first, an exchange Washington is unlikely to accept. So, diplomacy becomes a standoff of mutually exclusive red lines. By the end of the week, U.S. stockpiles of heavy rare earths fall below the Pentagon's 60-day threshold. The Defense Production Act is invoked to accelerate domestic extraction at Mountain Pass, California. Yet even with emergency funding, refining remains the bottleneck. The ore can be mined but not processed without Chinese technology. A late-night Bloomberg interview with resource analyst Ryan Castellou captures the paradox. The U.S. has the rocks, but China has the know-how. Until that gap closes, policy rhetoric won't translate into industrial resilience. His observation underscores the real vulnerability, not scarcity of materials, but scarcity of capacity. And then, without warning, a new variable enters. A Financial Times report reveals that Russia has offered to sell the United States refined rare earth metals through third-party intermediaries in Central Asia, an arrangement that would violate existing sanctions. The leak sparks debate in Congress. Should strategic necessity override diplomatic principle? The question divides even the president's inner circle. In the final scene, the Fort Worth Assembly Hall lights flicker back on. A small shipment of magnets from Japan has arrived, barely enough for a week's production. Workers unload the crates in silence. On one of them, a stenciled label reads, "Source, alternative supply, emergency use only." A foreman pauses, reads it again, and asks quietly, "How long can we keep calling this alternative before it becomes the norm?" No one answers. Outside, the American flag hangs motionless in still air, the machinery humming faintly below. Somewhere in Beijing, a technician logs another export license review, time-stamped 2359. The world's most powerful nations now wait on one bureaucrat's click. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.